Okay, this is part two of my video where I'm covering this article in The Guardian talking about Kyle Rittenhouse and his supposed fear of black people is why he shot Joseph Rosenbaum, Anthony Huber, and Gage Grosskreutz. Yeah, I know, I don't quite follow it either, but that's what the author here is doing. At any rate, we're going to pick up on this. Adobe Premiere screwed me up on this last one. It somehow got my audio and video out of sync. I was able to clear the cache and get back on track here, so we're going to do part two. Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With his powerful brainwaves cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnnie Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnnie Walker Dread Show.
Okay, so I'm going to pick up where we left off. I'll put a link to part one in the description below. And so here we go. It is reasonable to assume that police fear for their lives when they detain black suspects. It is reasonable for conservatives to assume that black voters will upset the political equilibrium if they are not systematically suppressed. Now, by the way, I want to make sure we have the right context. When he is saying it is reasonable to assume, he's talking about the perspective of what he conjures up as the typical white person in America. So this is not his claims. Got to be fair. And yes, it is reasonable to believe that Kyle Rittenhouse's white jurors would grant him the privilege of self-defense. And so the whole argument here is that Kyle walked into a Black Lives Matter protest, or was it a protest or a riot? These guys can't seem to make up their minds about that, but at any rate, he walks into a BLM protest, and all 12 jurors, all 12 of them, thought, oh my gosh, a BLM protest, how scary, there's a lot of black people there. Never minding the fact that BLM protests are typically mostly white, but whatever the case. So they had in this mind this fear of the Black Lives Matter participants, a lot of these black people, and they're scary, they're big, and therefore Kyle must have feared for his life, and therefore it's only natural to assume that when he claimed self-defense, he must have been terrified. I guess that's the argument here. The author doesn't do a very good job of really pounding that in, though, so we don't know for sure. All right, we move on here. The Rittenhouse verdict is proof that it is reasonable to believe that the fear of black people can absolve a white person of any crime. Really? Well, take a look here. The Georgia case with Ahmaud Arbery, the verdicts were read, about a week later, and those guys were all convicted. Gee, that would kind of destroy this person's argument, wouldn't it? He's kind of lucky he got this thing out before that verdict was read, because if he hadn't, he'd have to basically hit the old delete button on the entire article, because it kind of destroys his narrative. In truth, we all know that the fear of black people had nothing to do with the jurors' decision to absolve Kyle Rittenhouse of any crimes. Again, it's The Guardian. What can you say? Okay, so I go back to the Kenosha County Eyes article. Very well done. And this is Michael Chisholm or something like that. And he's the one that's referring to this article I just read. And so we'll come back to here, and it says, when reading Harriet's article from The Guardian, I got the same feeling I often get during the prosecution's closing argument in a criminal trial. Whether I'm responding to this talented writer, talented? Oh, come on. You got to be kidding me. In print or to a rhetorically skilled prosecutor in the courtroom, their claims feel very much like the landmines. They are easy to lay, but difficult and time-consuming to clean up. Therefore, to keep this article from becoming book length, I'll address in detail only two of Harriet's criticisms. The alleged fear of black people. Harriet claims that Rittenhouse was acquitted, at least in part, because white people, one of the scariest, most dangerous situations those white jurors could imagine is a BLM protest. And in his most extreme race-based claim, the Rittenhouse verdict is proof that it is reasonable to believe that the fear of black people can absolve a white person of any crime. No, the jury's verdict is not proof of any such thing. But to begin, in fairness to Harriet, He does mention in his article that the three people Rittenhouse shot, two of whom died, were white. Yeah, he mentions it, but his entire argument sounded like that he was treating them as if they were black. This is better than other critics, many of whom completely ignore that fact or even falsely state that the decedents were black. Nonetheless, Harry's attempt to tie a white person's shooting of three white men to race doesn't withstand scrutiny. Rittenhouse's actions and the jury's verdicts had nothing to do with fear of black people or even of BLM protesters. First, by the time of the shootings, legitimate BLM protests had been replaced by acts of arson, mayhem, and general lawlessness. The first person Rittenhouse shot, a white man named Rosenbaum, had threatened to kill him, chased him, and tried to take his gun. And he's white. And before Rosenbaum even decided to attack Rittenhouse, he was caught on film repeatedly yelling the N-word. In short, Rosenbaum was not black, nor was he a BLM protester. And it's really sad that we have to point these things out nowadays. You know, we've been at this trial for a year now, at least the shootings part, right? Looking at the evidence. And a year later, we're still having to point out to people that the people that Kyle shot were not black. Amazing. That's how bad our journalism is today. Second, the two white men that Rittenhouse subsequently shot went even further than Rosenbaum did. One pulled a gun and pointed at Rittenhouse. The other struck Rittenhouse in the head with a skateboard and then grabbed his rifle. In an example of extreme spin doctoring, the state's prosecutors mocked the idea of a skateboard being a dangerous weapon. However, that term is defined by how an object is used. Wisconsin prosecutors have even won convictions on dangerous weapons-related charges when a defendant uses a pillow, conviction upheld, or even his bare hands, conviction eventually reversed. A heavy object like a skateboard, when used to strike a person in the head or neck, most certainly qualifies. And I would be tempted if I was the defense, although it wouldn't really be allowed, but just to simply tell James Krause, who was up there in the closing arguments telling everybody that, well, a skateboard is something you give your kid for Christmas. You don't give dangerous weapons to kids. To simply stand there, let me run up behind you and hit you in the back of the head with this thing. Would you be willing to do it? And of course, no. Hell no. You'd split your skull with that thing. And that would be the perfect demonstration of how dangerous this thing can be. People would not allow themselves to be hit by it. Gee, it's probably pretty nasty. The point, of course, is that Rittenhouse didn't fear the three men because they were black. They weren't. Or because they were BLM supporters. Rittenhouse feared these three white men, and the jury found his fear reasonable, not because of who the men were, but because they were acting aggressively and violently at that time. The alleged white supremacy of self-defense. In a related topic, misconceptions about Wisconsin self-defense law are staggering. Boy, you ain't a kidding. And I have a lot of videos on this, right? People think that they know self-defense. They really don't. It varies from state to state, and quite often, self-defense laws can seem rather absurd. Before being fired for alleged journalistic violations when defending his brother against what he believed to be false allegations, CNN personality Chris Cuomo, boo, criticized Wisconsin self-defense law because he claimed it doesn't incorporate the reasonable person standard. Conversely, in his article in The Guardian, Harriet claims that Wisconsin's reasonable person standard is not only racist, a white person must have come up with this, he wrote, but actually helped Rittenhouse escape conviction. Yeah, a white person probably did. Given the fact that our laws are based on English common law, you probably can expect that just about any law that you pick out of the statutes is going to be written by a white person. That's just the way it is. It's changing, sure, but, let's face it, white people craft the majority of the laws that you have on the books. Both are wrong. As for Chris Cuomo, Wisconsin's law already incorporates a reasonable person standard. Of course it does. I've gone over that law numerous times. As for Harriet's claim, the second part of the self-defense test, the reasonable person standard, makes it more difficult for a defendant to win a self-defense trial. Yeah, you often overlook that part. First, to prevail on self-defense, the defendant must have actually subjectively believed certain things about the danger he was in and the force that he used to protect himself. That is, the defendant believed. Second, the defendant's beliefs must also have been reasonable. That is, the test is what a person of ordinary intelligence and prudence would have believed. This second part of the self-defense standard benefits the state, not the defendant. So in other words, the guardian is crying all about this reasonable standard thing and how racist it is, but in reality, it benefits the state, not the defense. Without this second part of the test, that is the reasonable person standard, the Rittenhouse prosecutors would have been dead in the water at trial. Rittenhouse proved his personal subjective beliefs through his own testimony and the multiple videos that showed him literally fleeing all three of his attackers. As far as what he subjectively believed, those two pieces of evidence were unimpeachable. The only reason the prosecutors had a prayer of winning a conviction, and probably the reason the jury took longer than expected to acquit, was the reasonable person prong of the test. The prosecutors argued several times that Rittenhouse's beliefs about the danger he was in and the force he needed to terminate the threats against him were not reasonable. They even went so far as to argue that Rittenhouse should have just taken his beating at the hands of his white attackers. I'd like to know where that came from. It's in James Krause's defense, but I went through his defense and I can't find it. If somebody can give me a link and a timestamp of where James Krause made such an idiotic statement, I'd really appreciate it. The jury ultimately rejected the state's position. But the state didn't lose because a reasonable person would be in fear of black people or of BLM protesters. Rather, the state lost because Rittenhouse was, and a reasonable person would have been, in fear of the three white men who threatened him, chased him, grabbed for his rifle, struck him in the head with a skateboard, and pulled a pistol on him. Harriet calls this white reasoning, but I have no idea what self-defense standard he would use in its place. And before proposing a new standard, any proponent should look beyond a single case that they like or don't like, and keep in mind that the standard will apply to black defendants as well. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead here. I'm going to go ahead and leave a link in the description below if you want to read the entire article. The author here, Michael Chisholm, I guess that's how you pronounce it, is a Kenosha criminal defense lawyer and author. His written work includes nearly 40 law review articles and 4 books on criminal law and procedure. At any rate, like my video, subscribe to my channel.